So this is class 9's tutorial, and in this we're going to do an introductory to rendering and using shaders inside of Maya. The first thing we're going to do is to make sure that the Arnold renderer is turned on in Maya. Right off the bat, if you actually go into the shelf here and you see an Arnold tab, or if you see the Arnold menu up here, Arnold is installed and it is working and functioning, so it's a clear sign you don't need to do these steps. But so you know how to use and check for plugins to see if they're installed anyways, you should follow along. So if you go to Windows, Settings, Preferences, and choose Plugin Manager, these are all the plugins that Maya has that we can install currently. I wouldn't go and check all of these. The more you have, the longer it's going to take to load up Maya. So you only really want the ones on that you're going to use just to keep things fast. But if we scroll to near the bottom, you should see a category that says MTOA. And then depending on if you're on Mac or PC, they'll have a different extension here. But MTOA, this is Arnold. So you want to make sure that next to MTOA, you have loaded turned on and auto load checked, and then you can just hit refresh, and then Arnold should load automatically every time you open it up. So this is our plugin manager. MTOA is is Arnold. Another thing that you guys are going to learn in the next tutorial, I mentioned it in the introduction, is for class 10's tutorial, you're going to have to use the unfold command when we do UV mapping. So I'm just going to show you this now. This is the unfold 3D plugin. If you are using a new Ryzen processor and you're getting errors when you're trying to unfold, uncheck these and hit refresh. And then it's going to use the old unfold algorithm, which works completely fine. Doesn't give you as nice a result, but it does work. So you can see that's another plugin that you can uncheck to get work normally. Okay, so we all should have Maya Arnold set up. We're going to create a very simple scene. I don't have a model to work with this week, so I'm going to use a pre-made model. This isn't not something you're going to use in a project. But for today, we're going to use a pre-made model. So if we go up to Windows again, we go General Editors, Content Browser. The content browser is just a bunch of pre-made things, effects, etc., that are built into Maya. And you can see there's categories here of different models in the sculpting base mesh folders. And I want you to just add one of these models. You just need one for now. So just find one and double click on it. And it should come into the workspace. You might need to zoom out quite a bit because right off the bat, so you guys know, like these are scaled to real world scale. So they're significantly larger than what we've been working with. So I'm going to just go and add a ground plane and scale this up. So I want to have a ground plane for shadows, to see shadows on today. But I'm going to make this much larger. Name it. And I'll call this reptile_geo. And then we're ready to get going. So any model will do. We can keep it the same scale. It does affect lights. So that's the one thing you're going to see very soon. The scale of your light, if it's a bigger scene, it obviously needs to have stronger light settings turned on. Okay, so just going to save this file, give it a name, in case anything happens. And we're going to go take a quick look through some of the render settings first. And we're going to do a much more in-depth exploration of the render settings in a couple classes. But for now, I want everyone to go and click on either this little icon, this is a shortcut for it, and you can see that this clapperboard is the render icon. With the cog on it means settings. Or if you switch to the rendering menu set, you can go render settings. Either work. I like to be able to kind of keep this on modeling most of the time, so I just click this button here. Okay, so right off the bat, you can see render using, and most likely it's set to Arnold Renderer. But you can see these are the default renderers that are built into Maya. In lecture, I talked about Maya software a bit and Arnold Renderer a bit. Those are the predominantly most used ones. Let's just select, for now, we'll keep it on Arnold hardware, or Arnold Renderer. And if we scroll down here, we can see some basic settings for when we render out. So by default, it's going to export out as an EXR type file. This is not usually the most compatible, especially if you want to go into something like Photoshop. So we can switch this. I like using PNGs. There's not really much compression on them. So I'll use a PNG for my export file type. We can adjust the naming convention. So now it's going to be currently the name of your file dot whatever frame it is. And again, if we're doing series, this is for a single frame, which we're going to be working on one image at a time. But for animation, we can switch it to one of these other names. Okay. If we scroll down, if we are doing animation, frame range will be highlighted. And this is where we can choose to render specific frames. So again, imagine if you're doing a 240 frame animation and you've already done the first 50 frames, then you could choose 51 to 240 here. Okay, you can choose which camera will render. Currently, we have this set to perspective. In a future class, we'll look at adding in new cameras. So we'll have a camera specifically for rendering, so it's not using the perspective view. Okay, and then this is the resolution. So by default, it's set to 960 pixels by 540. This is very low res, especially for a 2D image, and we can make this any size we want, or there's a whole bunch of presets here. But for today, let's just keep it the standard size, because we have to realize that if we increase this resolution, the rendering time will increase. So if I make it 4 times larger, it's going to take 4 times longer to render. And we're going to do a lot of render tests today. And until we're going to render out the final full quality image, like say for your project 3, we want to keep this resolution low so Maya renders faster. It saves us a lot of time. But we will change this for the final project when you're ready to render out. Okay, there's more tabs. These are the tabs we'll cover in a couple classes. Before we leave, just for a second, I want you to just switch this to Maya software and hit close. And the quickest way to render is to click this little button right here, or if again you're in the rendering menu set, you can go render. There's a bunch of options here, render current frame. Or you can click this second button in here, it's just the clapperboard. And you can see a render preview. Okay, now right off the bat, you can see this doesn't look very good. It looks very much like our viewport, right? One of the things that will make this look better, I'm gonna close this down for a second. I can put my lizard character and hit 3 and put it into smooth shading mode. And it should now render, and you can see how much nicer the smoothness looks. Still doesn't look very good around the legs, even compared to this view here. So not very good. We don't have shadows. The reason we don't really have shadows off the characters is because there's no lighting in the scene. And what we're going to do, we're in the render view right now. It's a window that pops up and shows us our preview. Right now we're rendering with Maya software. It's not a good renderer. Let's switch to Arnold. So let's click right here. This is another place we can switch. And we're going to go turn on Arnold Renderer. And we're going to redo the frame. So you can click either here or here, same button. And your image is going to come in like this, and it's all black. Okay, the reason why it looks like it's working in Maya software and it's not working in Arnold Renderer is that Maya software has kind of a default lighting setup, kind of like a skylight that lights your scene. And Arnold doesn't have this. So we need to add lights to our scene in order to actually see anything inside of Arnold. So let's go up into our rendering shelf here. And these are all Maya's default lights, okay? And they have different kind of shapes and sizes. What we're gonna grab right now is a directional light. So I'm gonna click that. And this is an actual light in the scene. Again, it's gonna look a little small here because our scene, this is set to real scale and this is kind of set to Maya's default. But let's just make this a little larger. Doesn't really make too much of a difference, but you can see this is what a directional light is. And it shoots light in a specific direction. And right now I'm gonna cast it going down onto this lizard. So now that I have one light in my scene and you see it shows up here in the outliner, and we can select, move, rotate it like any other object. When I render it, again, you can see here, I'm in the Arnold renderer, it's working. I'm gonna click this again, reframe it, and you can see it's definitely working in the image now, in the Arnold renderer. So you can see glossiness on the actual character model, a little bit of reflection from the actual body underneath inside the body. We weren't really seeing that reflection in Arnold software or in Maya software. We're seeing that in Arnold. Just to show you, Maya software does do shadows, although currently it's not set to show shadows. So you can see the difference. Arnold render takes longer to render for sure, but dramatically better results. But the problem with we're seeing here is if we look at the shadows and we look at what I was talking about inside the lecture, by default, these shadows are hard edged. Okay, so they're not soft edge shadows and they're not being calculated like real lighting should. And that's because we're using all of our default lights. Any of these lights here that we see will give us hard edge shadows like this. So we need to understand that these lights that are here, they're kind of designed for like the Maya software renderer. They're not really designed to fully utilize what Arnold renderer can do. So I'm gonna close this down and I'm gonna go and delete our directional light, select it and hit the delete key. And I'm gonna add in, you can see like there's an area light, but I'm just gonna quickly add this. You can see that it's an area light right here. I'm gonna delete that. We're to add an Arnold specific light, we're gonna go up to the Arnold tab here and go to Arnold lights. And these are all lights that are designed for Arnold, obviously. So here's our area light. This is Arnold's version of the area light. So I'm gonna click this and add it. And you can see in its name, it says AI area light. And this lowercase AI is a signifier that it's made for Arnold and will only work in Arnold. So we're gonna see this a little bit later with specific shaders. But that AI is telling us it's designed to work with Arnold. So I'm gonna move this back and kind of up and in place. Scale it up because the scale of this light does matter. This box will make light now. And the difference between Arnold lights and regular lights are the regular lights that we have, they don't have what's called quadratic attenuation, or they don't have light fall off. Easier way to understand it. And what that means is that with their directional light, it casts light and that light never gets weaker the further away it gets from the source. And that's why our shadows were hard edged. where something like our AI area light, it does fall off. And that means that that light is stronger the closer the object is to the light. But as that light gets cast further and further away, it gets weaker and weaker and weaker. So we've now added this light in, and I'm going to go do a quick render, and we might get some unexpected results. And you can see my image is dark, your images might be dark as well. And that's because the strength and exposure of the light isn't really set to this scene scale. You remember when I created that light, it was incredibly tiny, and I had to scale it up quite a bit. And it's not really, it was designed for kind of like a small, tiny scene, not for something that's designed in real world scale. So we need to increase the strength of this light. So if we go to AI Area Light 1, click on it, and we open up our attribute editor over here, you can see there's the intensity and there's the exposure setting. Okay? The intensity basically means like how intense is the light, how quickly does it fall off. Something with a low intensity will fall off much faster than something with a high intensity. And again, because we've scaled this light up so much, I might have to bring this up quite a bit. So I'm going to try 10 at first, and we can manually make this as large as we need. And my exposure is currently at 0. Let's make this stronger. I'm going to set it to 1 to make the light. And exposure is just brightness. How bright is this light? So I'm going to render. And you can see it's still not strong enough. So I'm going to come back in here and set my exposure to 5. Try rendering again. And I'm starting to get my first hints of light there. And again, if your scene size is different, the scale of your light is different, you might need to adjust these numbers different than mine. But what I'm doing is just increasing them. I need this to be a little intense. It's cutting off and falling off way too fast for me. So I'm going to go and set this to like 20 on mine. And you can see that light, it doesn't get brighter, it just goes further out. So I'm going to go up to like say 50. And you can see that that fall off is going much, much further. And again, if I go up to like say 100, pretty far, you can see how much further that light is going. The fall off is way back there. So you can kind of follow, it's not making the light brighter, it's just making the fall off, basically the light strength longer. So it might look a little brighter here, but it's just because the fall off is that much further out. Okay, so your numbers might be a little different. And again, this is the exposure here. So if I cut this in half, that light is going to be much weaker. And if I go much further with this, it's going to be much brighter. And especially with a glossy shader, like we currently have, that brightness can go very, very harsh, very fast. I think I had it at 10 initially. And that looks fairly good. A little hot here, not a big deal. Okay, so there's our default light. We're going to do a 3-point light up setup pretty soon. But at least we have one light that is working. Okay, and what you'll notice is that our shadows are soft. They do look very noisy and grainy, most likely. Again, we're going to learn in a couple classes how to kind of tackle that noise and that grain. But that is a soft shadow. It's a much more realistic shadow than what we were getting. Okay, now we can adjust the color of our light. Right now it's white, and you can see the color right here. So if I click that, we can choose any color or any of these preset colors. So if I wanted to make this a bright red light, I can click that, render it, and it's going to be red. Here's a yellow light. And again, any shade we want. So I want a little bit of yellow, not that intense. Maybe I want it a little more orange. So I can bring it down here. So it's a much warmer light. And there we go. Nice warm orange light. Okay, we're gonna add in new lights in a bit too. So you can have lights with different colors play off of each other. I'll show you that when we have the 3-point light set up, but we can adjust it to any color. There's also the option if you want, again, you're going for more realism, we can use color temperature. And this is with a Kelvin scale. So 6,500 Kelvins, again, if you know your light bulbs or you know your light temperatures, this is a very cold bluish light, okay? Something basically like sunlight. And if I were to go down to something like 3,200, that's a very warm looking light, as we see there. And then maybe even something like 2,800 might be something like candlelight. So you can use, if you know, this is especially important if you ever have to do compositing where you're matching video with 3D objects. If you have real lights set up in your scene and you know the color temps, you can definitely come in here and match it to those exact color temps. It's really, really useful. Okay, there's a lot of options here. You can kind of control pretty much all the light values and shadow values if you need to. Useful ones though, right now light spread is basically, I'm gonna render it from this view here. So note that it won't show this in the render, but my light's right there. And you can see that that light casts pretty much all the way out this way. It's more intense in the middle, but it casts evenly kind of in almost 180 degrees, not quite, but almost. And with the spread, I can lower this and I'm gonna re-render it. Okay, and you can see it's kind of intensifying. And the lower we go, the shallower that is. So it's working more like a spotlight when we bring this number down. And I can go super small and it's gonna be very much just a straight line, very much like a flashlight or something. So again, because, you know, I'll just show you this roughly the same framing I had before. The lighting looks much more intense. You can see my shadows are much darker. And it's because, you know, as we reduce the spread of the light, that amount of fall off is gonna be less. It's making the light much, much more powerful and potent. It's condensing it down into a range. So again, depending on what you're trying to do and mimic, you might adjust the spread. You know, for a flashlight, you would lower it a heavy. If it's just like a lighting in a room, you might raise it all the way up like it was, or somewhere a little bit higher up. But you have full control over that spread with this area light. So you can take something that's, you know, a square and make it much, much more directional if you need to. Okay, another nice option is, especially when you have parts in your scene where you have multiple lights, you might put kind of some lights in the kind of fill in color, and you might not want them to cast shadows. So you can always uncheck this, and that light will light the scene up, but you can see it doesn't actually cast shadows anymore. In this case, it doesn't make sense, but maybe in a future example, when we get a 3-point light up, we might not want all of them to cast shadows. Okay, and again, we have like volumetric shadows. We can turn them off. Volumetric is much more realistic, and we can increase the sample so you can see without it, it's a little less noisy. Definitely going to be more noisy with it on, but we can increase the samples. It just takes longer to render. Okay, but the key things to adjust: intensity, exposure, probably color occasionally. Okay, so we got our first light in our scene, and we're gonna do a typical kind of 3-point light setup. So what you wanna generally do is, this is a great lighting setup. It's very flexible. used in a lot of different scenes to actually light them, and it's very quick and easy to change. But what you generally want to do is figure out which is your main light, okay? And this is going to be called your key light. And if this is where my, say, character or my scene is kind of facing, I want to bring this to either the left or the right side. It doesn't matter. In this case, I'm going to bring it over here. And I'm going to just rotate this just to kind of make sure that it's cast onto the character where I want, something like that. And this is my main light. So this is going to be, it's called my key light. This is the light that's going to control most of the scene. Be by far the most powerful light. So I'm going to just go and quickly render this. And you can see that it's being lit now from the one side, and then this other side is much darker. And I'm just going to go over here and rename this key light, just so we know. Okay, now the problem with having a singular light in your scene is you can see that it's casting light nicely on this side, but because I only have one light source, the shadows on the other side are very harsh or hard shadows. So it's not the smoothest gradient over here, and this is very, very dark in the shadows. So to control the amount of shadows in this side, you can have them very harsh if you want, but to be able to control how dark these shadows are, this is where you're going to want to create a second light that goes on the opposite side of the key light. So to do this quickly, I'm going to just duplicate this. So Command D. I'll bring it over to the other side and kind of rotate it around. Make sure it's kind of facing my character. And I'm going to render it again. And now you can see that I don't really have shadows on either side because they're currently, and I'm going to just rename this fill light. It's because both of the lights have equal power. And our key light, which is the main light source in the scene, that should be the brightest light, okay? So this fill light should generally be weaker. And currently I have my exposure set at 10. So if I were to lower this to say 5, or your number might be different, adjust it to be lower, you can see that now I have shadows back in there. And if I want those shadows to be harder or darker, I could lower that number. And you can see they're much sharper edge and much darker. And if I want them to be softer, I can increase that number. So you can see that this side here is darker, much softer than this. This side's brighter, but I still have those shadows in here. So I can control how harsh the shadows are, how strong they are, just by using my second fill light. Really, really handy. A little darker. Again, you don't have to use whole numbers. You can use the slider, use decimal places. But you can see how it lets me control this. I liked it at 7. Okay, now the third light, which we won't necessarily see its big use in a scene like this, we're going to use a backlight. And what a backlight does is that whatever is in the foreground, it helps create some separation between the object in the foreground and the background itself. And it's very important for like very dark, busy backgrounds. We don't necessarily have the busy background here, but it should still create the silhouette of this character a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is, again, zoom out. I'm going to take one of my lights, doesn't matter which one. I'm going to go grab my fill light, and I'm going to hit Command D. I'm going to rename this backlight or something like hair light, another name for it, same thing. And I'm going to move this behind, and this is my main key light. So I want to put it on the opposite side of the key light. And I'm going to bring it here. Oops, wrong thing. Rotate that around. Okay, usually this light, especially in a real world scene, is brought up higher. So this way it's not directly in the camera shot, so you don't see that bright light in the camera shot. And it's pointed down for characters, usually at the back of the head. This is why it's called a hair light sometimes, because it points at the back of the hair and it helps create a silhouette. Because especially with people with like light color hair, like a light blonde, that hair kind of blends a lot into the background. So a backlight will make a stronger silhouette. But I'm going to put it at kind of the back shoulders of this character, something like that. Okay, now I'm going to come back in here and render this out. And you can see like what the hair light's doing is it's adding a little bit of light here, but you can see this is where it's really benefiting. It's creating more separation on the character from the background. It's a much, much more distinct silhouette. So I'm going to adjust the angle a bit. Much nicer separation. And just to show you, if I were to bring the exposure down all the way on this, this is what it looks like without. And you can see that separation here, not as good. And it doesn't have to be as powerful as the fill. I'm going to make it a little bit weaker, but it should give me a little bit more definition around. Okay, so I'm much happier with that than what we had. Again, it's, you know, if I can make one light brighter, make another one weaker, makes it really easy. Even if you're going for like stylistic lighting, like say if I wanted my character to be much more like a silhouette, I could go to my backlight, and if I make this something that's very strong, like 15, if your backlight is stronger than the foreground lights, it will start creating silhouettes. So you can see my background light is very powerful. I'm going to lower that a bit to 10. And you can see this is coming from that background light. And then now I could take something like my key light and bring that down. So if I bring that down and my fill light down, you're going to see a much stronger silhouette for the character because it's being backlit. So again, once you kind of understand some basics of light, where to place them, what the strength kind of does, it makes it much, much easier to kind of come in and adjust and do some stylistic lighting and build it the way you want. I'm going to go back to my default settings. Pretty happy with this for now. Okay, you can also do some, like I said, they can have different color lights. So here's my key light, and maybe I go and make this like a blue tone, pretty extreme blue, but I'll make it a blue. And then here's my fill light, and I could go the opposite. So make it warm. You know, I'm gonna go pick a red here, make it a little weaker. It's pretty intense. But I can create like a nice contrast between them, different color tones. And again, you can make your image much more stylized this way if you want to as well. So pretty easy to make visually, you know, with lights, not even adjusting your models. With just straight lights, you can do a lot to make your scene look the way you want. A lot of places to do here creatively. Again, even if I want the color to be much more subtle, I could bring this down. So it's just a subtle pink. And then maybe this one here. Bring that down to a subtle blue. And it still gives you a little bit of that contrast between like warm and cool very easily. So that is a typical 3-point lighting setup. Most scenes can be lit this way. Again, in more complex scenes, you might have to move these around a bit or add in like a fourth, fifth, sixth light, or add in different lights for different parts of an object in a scene. Like say there's a lamp creating its own light source. But for most scenes that you guys are gonna be working with, 3-point lighting is it's the easiest place to start, and it's very flexible for sure. Okay, I also know that with fall off, I'll just point this out one last thing. Positioning matters. If your light is closer to your object, that light will be more intense the closer it is, because it's making that fall off go further out on it, just like a real light. These AI area lights work exactly like real lights, and they give you very similar results. Okay, so next thing we're gonna do, we're gonna look at applying some shaders to our objects. So by default, everything is, it uses a default, what's called a Lambert shader, which is just a matte shader. And by default, you've seen this, Maya shades everything in a matte gray. Okay, now when we brought in our new objects, they have a different shader. You can see it's a glossy shader, which I believe in this case, it's a Phong shader. And it's kind of a skin tone-ish to start with, but we can adjust that. These shaders, I'm going to show you how to add them in. Keep in mind, these are the default Maya shaders. They're kind of designed for Maya software, and they work in Arnold, but they don't get the maximum potential out of Arnold. So I'm going to start with these basic shaders, but I don't recommend you use them for your projects once you know how to use the Arnold shaders. So let's select our lizard or whatever object you're working with. And in the attribute editor, the last tab is always the shader that it currently is set to. And you can see that by default, it's a blend, which is kind of a semi-gloss. It's not full gloss, it's a semi-gloss. And the color right here is set to this kind of flesh tone. If we click this and I were to pick something else, make it a little paler green, now it's green, and you can see it's green in the render. Okay, now for my ground plane, you can see if I scroll to the end, it's Lambert 1, which is your default. So I don't recommend switching this color, or every time you add in a new polygon or something into your scene, it's going to be that color. So I like to always never mess with my Lambert 1. So maybe I want to apply a different shader. And currently, this is a blend. A blend is halfway between matte and glossy. It's a semi-gloss. And we can see that in the render. Okay, now what if I want to go to a full gloss? A full gloss, up here in our rendering tab or shelf, these are all of our default kind of shaders for Maya. They're not the best, but they're your default shaders. I can go to a Phong shader, Phong or Phong-E. They're just slight variations on each other, but I'm going to select Phong. Phong is full gloss, so I'm just going to render it out, same color green. Not dramatically different, but it is glossier, so you can see the color of the ground kind of popping up more on it. And if I wanted it to be matte, our default matte shader is Lambert. So it was currently blend, we have Lambert, and we have Fong. So I'm going to set it to a Lambert, reset my color, and render it again. And you can see now it's a matte shader, so there's no gloss on it. Okay, now these, the problem with these shaders and why they're not so good is that you don't get full control. Like, you have to kind of pick and choose, you know, okay, do I start with a gloss or start with a matte? Other shaders, which I'm going to show you, I'm going to show you one shader to use in Arnold. This allows you to adjust your glossiness, your roughness for matte, your reflection, your transparency. It lets you adjust all of the sliders with just one shader. So you don't have to keep switching and adjusting shaders. And that's why these are really simple, basic shaders. They don't do metalness, so they can't really look like metal even when you put the glossiness all the way up. They don't do everything, and you have to keep switching them if you change your mind and you need to adjust things for the shaders. So they're as basic as they can be. We're just going to use them to kind of start out. So for my ground plane, I don't want this currently to be reflective, but I can go and add a new Lambert. So now it's Lambert 3, or we can rename this to something like ground. And I don't want it to be gray, I want it to be white. So now it's going to be a little brighter in the actual render. Or if I wanted it maybe glossy, I could go and create this as a Fong. And I'm going to switch its color to maybe black, see how black gloss looks. And you can see that because it's glossy, I kind of have like a nice mirrored reflection on it. Not too bad. Okay, nice things about these. They do have some settings. So our render view, if we scroll down, each different of these shaders will have different settings. But you can see, you know, for reflectivity, it's currently set at 0.5. So if I boost this up to 1, it's going to be more reflective. And you can see it's not a full reflection, but pretty close. And if I were to put this down to like 0.2 or something, it's going to be much less. So you should see a much darker reflection. So you do get some adjustments there. They're not the best, but yeah. Different shaders have different settings here. Just showing you the basics. Okay, a lot of people students don't realize this as well. Currently, my lizard is set to Lambert 2. And I can call this like, you know, like lizard green. Again, it's good to rename these. You always want to rename your shaders because we don't want them to be named like Lambert 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just like our objects, we want to always rename everything, especially if you go to other software, like something like Substance Painter. The organization here absolutely matters. It's incredibly important that you name it properly because you're going to have to use those names over there to know what you're selecting. But as I'm here, you have to remember that we don't have to have an object have just one shader across the whole object. And what that means is I can go to something like face mode, and I can select a bunch of faces. So I've selected kind of the head. And the body is matte, and I want the head to be kind of semi-gloss, so I'm going to give it a blend. And I want this head to be like this kind of rosy color here. And you can see now the head is a different shader than the body. And you can see in the attribute editor, there's the Fong 2, Again, if I select the whole object, so there's lizard green, there's blend. I'm gonna call this like lizard head. And again, I could go into one of my other views. I'm gonna grab a bunch of these in the center, add a Fong shader, and I'll make this a more intense color. So I'm gonna go kind of this bright blue. And then I'm gonna go and add a stripe on the tail. Make this bright yellow just so you can see. And you can see that the lizard now has multiple shaders on it. So it's very easy. You just go into face mode, select the faces that you want to change a different color. You have to apply a new shader. This is the quickest way to do it. And then you can go and adjust those shader settings afterwards. Really, really easy. Okay, so the next thing I want to show you is how to use Arnold specific shaders. And you're going to get much better results with this shader. You only have to know one shader. So we don't have to worry about like what is a Lambert, what's a blend, what's a Fong. You can use one shader and get the same, make a matte material, make a glossy, make a transparent, make something look like glass, make something look like metal. We can do this all with one Arnold specific shader. So that's the one we're going to use. And I highly recommend you only use the Arnold specific shaders when rendering with Arnold. You're going to get better results. So I'm just going to reset my scene a bit. I'm going to select my ground plane. And for now, I'm just going to give a basic Lambert and set it to 1. And I'll call this ground. It's going to rename it ground 1 because I already had ground. There we go. And I'm just going to show you from scratch. I'm going to select the lizard. This is what I think the easiest way to apply an Arnold shader is, at least the fastest. It doesn't matter what shader you apply. I'm just going to go throw the basic Lambert onto this. Okay, and the quickest way to convert this from a Lambert to another shader is right here. It says type, and you can see that it's currently a Lambert shader. This is a quick menu for the more common types of shaders you could use, and you can see there's a lot of them. If we scroll upwards, anything that says AI is a specific Arnold shader. So you can see there's one for like tune style coloring, one for hair style coloring, etc. Most likely the one we want to use is AI standard surface. So this is our default Arnold. This is the only one I'm going to show you with Arnold. So let's select that. Again, I don't want everything to be AI standard surface 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is going to be renamed lizard. It takes a little bit more understanding of specific options with this shader. But once you know some basic settings, it dramatically opens up your options for editing. So right off the bat, I'm going to select the lizard, open up my lizard tab. That's the shader name. And the color is the obvious one. It's currently set to white. I can click this and I can set it to green, and now you can see it's that green color. It's very simple, very similar to what we had before with the blend. A little less shiny than the default settings for blend. We'll look at adjusting this color in a bit, so it's not all one color immediately. Okay, but that's a basic setting. Again, it's technically not using this color 100%. It's using it 80%. So if I bump this up to 1, it's going to be a little bit more intense version of that green. If I lower it, it's going to be a less intense version of it. Usually you're going to keep this weight relatively high. Okay. Now, before we couldn't mimic metal, and now we have a new slider called metalness, and this is one of the huge advantages of it. Right now it's set to 0, and you can see the lizard doesn't look like it's made of metal. Let's bump this to 1 and render this out. And you can see it looks like metal. That quick, that easy. Much, much more like real metal. And you can see that it kind of looks maybe like brushed aluminum. So it's not super shiny. It looks like it's been sanded down. And if we go into our specular menu, which is right here, we have a roughness setting. If I lower that roughness, it's going to be shiny metal like chrome. And if I raise this, so I'm not going to go all the way up to 1, but if I go to like 0.8, something very high, it's going to look much, much more matte or brushed aluminum. So you can see that metalness, it's there, but it doesn't really show when we raise the roughness too high. So there's 0.5. You can see it looks much more like brushed aluminum. So it's just a couple numbers like metalness and roughness. And we can get dramatically different appearances. Keep in mind these graininess, we'll learn how to fix that in a couple classes. Just some settings to help kind of fix that. But you can see, we're working with one shader and how much different that shader can look. And again, we don't need full metalness if you don't want to. You could do like 50%, just to give a little bit of that kind of glossy satin look. So maybe if I was trying to make, I'm not trying to make it look like chrome. I'm trying to make like satin sheets in a scene, or satin clothing or a cape. I might add a little bit of metalness into that so it gets a little bit of that gloss back into it, that appearance. Okay, I'm going to bring this all the way down. And what you'll notice too, we've been playing with roughness. Okay, if I bring this roughness all the way up, it's going to turn this into basically a Lambert. So that is a matte finish. If I bring this all the way down, or close to down, like maybe 0.1 and lower, it's going to look much more like a Fong. And you can see it's very glossy. And if I go kind of in between with the roughness, so maybe like 0.5, maybe like 0.3 to 0.6, somewhere in that range. Yeah, 0.5 might be a little bit too high. But maybe like a 0.3 would be much closer to the blend material. And that's what you need to understand. These shaders that I showed you, Blend, Lambert, and Fong, they basically allow you to adjust the color and the roughness. And that's it. This is already giving us those same adjustments and a metalness, which is much, much better. And we don't need different shaders to adjust the roughness properly. We can do that all inside with one slider. So much, much better than these. It's, once you get it down, much easier to use than those as well. Okay, so specular base is your base color. Specular is basically your gloss, your shininess. And again, the higher it is, the more shiny it's going to be. The lower the roughness, the higher the roughness, the shinier it will get. So you can see at 0, it should be very shiny. Simple as that. This is your index of refraction. And again, this is what I talked about in the lecture. So every object on the planet has an index of refraction. So if you go and look up like the index of refraction for like copper or aluminum or brick, you'll get a specific number and you can type that number in to make your results a little bit more realistic. For what I'm doing right now, this isn't that big of a deal. But if we were to have light transmit through this, this number is incredibly important. And light could not transfer through these, okay? If we want to do light transferring through, and this is usually if you're doing things like glass, we need to open up the transmission menu. So I'm going to go ahead and pop this open, expand it. And the transmission weight is basically transparency. So right now, though, it's got a value of 0, so light can't move through it. And if I move this to like 0.5, you'll see that all of these are now adjustable, but it's going to let half of the light through it. So I'm going to re-render it. It should take quite a bit longer to start doing this. But you can see that it's letting some light through. So it looks a lot more like glass. Okay, and if I were to go up to say a full 1, it's going to look like glass. Okay, and what you're seeing, all this kind of weird parts here, this is the scene kind of getting, the light from the scene getting refracted through the object. And the index of refraction definitely has an effect on this. So again, if I were to go switch this to a different number, like 1.31, I'll try that. It's just a random number I'm picking. It was at 1.5 before. You're going to see the way that light disperses through it is it's different, and you might not notice until you kind of see it, different things. But you definitely, you know, crystal, plastic, everything has its own index of refraction. And you'll get different looking results depending on it. You can see that number is raised. Look how much like more of this pink color kind of came through. Much, much different in the body. Okay, now you might notice that it's no longer green. And that's because, you know, if I were to lower this to like, again, like 0.8 or something, we'll see that green. And when it's at 1, all of a sudden that green disappears. You can see this looks more like a nice marble or like a bottle or something. Okay, so when I bring this up to 1, and render it, that color goes away. And the reason for that is that when this is full value, when it's lower, it's mixing the transmission value with, you know, the specular and the base color, which the base color is green. And when it's not, you can see even in our outliner, it's kind of invisible right now with the transmission. But when it's not, I'm going to go and open up this menu here. When it is 100%, we won't have any color. We actually have to come down here to the color. And this is where we can adjust the color of the transmission. So again, if I wanted a green, I could make it like green glass. And there we go. Kind of looks like an old bottle. You can see that now that the light, it wasn't doing this before. This is called caustics. And as the light goes through, it actually casts a green shadow. It looks pretty bad here. But we weren't getting that before when we didn't have this color set. See with the mix, it's going to be a lot more controlled, the shadows, but we're seeing that caustics in play. Again, we can even mix colors in here, get different results if needed. You can see those reflections are green tinted now. And then the glass color is more of a pale pink. So it really gives you a lot of control. It gives you kind of two colors to kind of work with and to, make, the reflections, everything the color that you want them to be. So maybe I want this to be like clear glass, but I want the reflections to be a little bit of pale blue in them. You can definitely go and adjust and match that to match your reference or aesthetics choice. And again, I'm using only one shader, AI standard surface, just adjusting the settings that we need. Okay. Other ones, I'm going to come back to subsurface because it's a little hard to demo on here. But I'm going to take my transmission all the way down because I don't want to mix these right now. You could try mixing them though and create unique shaders. I'm going to go skip down to emission. And right now the weight is set to 0. And emission means does this shader cast light? Currently it's setting no light. If I go and bump it up to 1, this is now a light source and it should cast light in my scene. Okay, and this is how you can take objects in your scene and make them cast light. Right now it's full value because my weight is set to 1. But if I were to like drop this to like 0.5, it will cast light, but you should see the original shader on it still. As you can see there, it's casting light. You can see it. Maybe I just want a little bit of light, a little bit of glow. I'm going to go down to like 0.2. But it is casting and illuminating from itself. And yeah, I turned off transmission, but I can easily bring this up. Might take a little longer to render. Good to save before you set renders in case your computer crashes. Now we can see glass, but that glass is emitting light from itself. And just to show you, I could bring this down. You can switch the color of the light as well, which is really important. So it casts a specific color. I'm going to bring that down. And I'm just going to, very quickly here, add another shader to the head, just to demo this. So I'm going to grab everything in the head, give it a new shader, name it lizard head. And I'm going to set it to AI standard surface. And again, they can have different shaders. So this is going to be the color white. And I'm going to go ahead and increase its emission. So I'm going to make this something like 0.6. And now just the head will cast light. So again, you can see I'm mixing, matching, using things, using parts of my own shader to actually light, which is really useful. Again, none of these shaders can do transmission, and they absolutely can't do emission. Okay. Now, what's really great is I'm going to go and I'm just going to go and select this again. And I'm going to go to my original lizard. I guess I didn't rename the AI standard surface, so it's going to be lizard head. But there's my original shader for the body. What's really nice about the AI standard surface shader is you really do want to learn and understand these settings. But if you're unsure when you're starting, or you want to try to get something you don't know where to start, there's a bunch of preset materials you can use. So if we go, and it has to be on AI standard surface here, but we have presets. And you can see there's a whole bunch of different presets of different shader types. So there's chrome, copper, velvet, anything you can think of, skin, wax, car paint, metallic, jade, rubber. And these are good. And you can replace the current shader with them, or you can blend. So like, even if you want to mix and match these, I could be like, I want 50% glass, 50% diamond. And you can blend the settings to see what the results create. But I think these are a good starting point. So if I wanted like the body to be chrome, I could replace it with chrome. And now you should see it very reflective, right? And if you know what your settings are, I can tell you right now, like there's our base color is white. Okay, the specular roughness is brought all the way down, so that gives it its gloss. The metalness is pumped all the way up. That's what makes it look like chrome. And that's it. I mean, we already kind of did that earlier. We just had a color chrome. But there's a preset for it if you don't know what you're doing. Here's copper, and we know that metalness is going to be up higher in it. And the metalness is still at 1, but the copper has a little bit of roughness in it. And we saw that earlier when we did our sliders. Okay, let's go to one that might be tougher. Let's try glass, and we're going to replace this. And there's some nice, much more realistic glass. And again, we can adjust them. Like the presets of starting point, you can go adjust these after. But we know, like I told you, glass, that's letting light through. We have to go to the transmission section. And you can see transmission was bumped all the way up. And we can see up here, the IOR is set to 1.52 for default here. But there we go, that's their default glass shader. And you can adjust it to match what you need. Here's frosted glass, so let's replace this. Try out another preset. You can see some shaders take longer to calculate. This is one because its roughness has been increased. It's going to take longer to calculate. And you can see the roughness did get put up to 0.4, where before it was at 0. But there's a nice frosted glass. Okay, so there's a bunch in here that you should try out. I'm going to show you, there's a couple examples of them, but wax and skin. This is going to show you the one setting I didn't show you before. So let's go to skin and hit replace. And skin or wax, what they're using is, I'm going to pop this open, is the subsurface menu. Okay, and what the subsurface menu is doing is that it lets light through the object, but it knows that the object, as it goes through the object, that light gets weaker and weaker. So with glass, it goes straight through it, but it just bends it. It refracts that light. But with subsurface, what happens is that the light goes through, and the thicker the object is, the most likely that light will get trapped in that object. So the center of that object will be much darker. The outer edges of it will be a little bit more transparent. And a skin shader works like this. So a good example to think of is if you ever put a flashlight up or any light up directly onto the palm of your hand, and you look at the back of your hand, you will see that your hand, the top of your hand is glowing red. And that is because the blood, the light goes through your blood, and it kind of lights up your hand that way. And if you go through your fingers, they'll probably be more red because there's not as much thickness there. And if you go through your palm, it'll be a little bit less red because there is more thickness there. And the light is getting through, but it's getting, the color of it's getting changed. and the the strength of it gets weakened as it goes through. So things like wax is a good example that needs subsurface scattering or subsurface shading. Skin is another one. Again, if you look at your ears and your nose tend to be a little bit like rosier than the rest of your body because they're thinner. The skin on your nose is much thinner than even in your cheeks. So the more light kind of goes through and makes it a little rosier. So this is our default skin. This is the skin color here. And then the second tone, the radius, that's kind of the color it's going to shift to when light goes through it. So you can see that that's kind of a natural flesh tone there, and we can adjust that to any color. And then it's going to make it a little bit redder because that blood, as the light goes through the bloods in your vein, it should make this tone a little bit redder. Simple as that. So I'm going to re-render this. You're going to see it looks much noisier because we need a lot more render passes, and it takes a lot longer to render a subsurface shader faster. But you can see it looks much more skin-like. You can see parts where it's thicker. It's more of the natural tone. Parts where it's thinner, it's definitely going to let more of that light through on it. Definitely looks much, much waxier than it did before. And yeah, any tone here absolutely will work. I'm going to go back to this pale green. And I might want it to be slightly different tone depending on, I have to really look at a lizard example. But you'll see that subsurface scattering, let that color kind of shift through. And it does look different than just a matte green. So great for skin, especially when your model's set to right scale. And especially with these specific lightings, you'll get more use out of this for sure. And again, there's a scale here that you can adjust. So if I bump this up, it's going to look different on how it lets the light through on it. And you can see here, if you look down at the fingers, as I increase that scale, you can see that secondary color is showing more and more because these are the thinnest parts we can see on the model. So it's letting more subsurface scattering through it. And if I boost up that scale even higher, and again, you can make this manually stronger, we'll see more and more of this tone in the body. But you can see it in the fingers underneath especially. So you can see how that mimics wax. Much, much more accurate. It mimics skin as well. But look how noisy it is. So we're going to learn in a couple classes how to fix that. So your presets are good to start with. I would spend some time personally trying each preset out, trying to see what they look like rendered, and then looking at the settings. And if you follow my initial instructions, you'll kind of get an idea what those settings will be. But it doesn't hurt to look through the settings, see what they're setting it to. And once you get that down, I don't usually use the presets. I find it quicker to go and adjust these. But you can use the presets, but don't be afraid. What I'm saying is don't be afraid to go and change them. And something might not look exactly the way you want. With the right adjustments, you should get it looking the exact way you want. And I really want you guys to do this before you go into do class 10's tutorial. Play around and practice with these shaders a lot. Okay, because it's a big deal. You're going to use a lot of these shaders in the project. Okay, so one of the things I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to a pretty basic shader here. I want to get rid of one of these because they're going to take a little bit longer. So any of these are fine, but I'm just going to go back to Chrome for a second because I know it's easy going to be to switch it back. I'm going to lower the metalness down for now. I'm going to switch the color to a basic green. I'm going to bump my roughness up to, I'll bump it up all the way just for now. No transmission. Should render much faster. Okay, and right now it's a solid color green. If I didn't want this to be a solid color green, I can use either what's called a node to change the, how it's colored in. Um, or I can use a texture, which is technically using a node, but then we're gonna add in a file through it. So what I'm gonna do is show you the most basic coloring nodes first. Right now, this is controlling my color. So we know it's green and it's showing here. If I go next to the color box, this little checker box, and you can see most of these options have it. This little checker box here means connect to a node. And a node can do any number of things in our shader network. So I'm gonna click this connect to a node button, and this will override this color. So let's click that. And you can see that a node menu pops up. And these are all the nodes we can connect to. And there's actually more in here, but these are our default nodes we can connect to. And you can see some of them are like, it's gonna create a checker pattern onto the object, or it's gonna create a noise pattern on them, or you could connect a movie. We're gonna use one called file to connect it to a texture in a couple minutes. But we're gonna start with just a very simple one. We're gonna connect it to a ramp, and a ramp is a gradient. So I'm gonna click this, and you can see that I have a gradient here, and I'm just gonna render it right now, and it should go kind of from black to white. And currently you can see that right there, it goes black to white, and then kind of black to white, not really the way we're expecting, especially on the hands. And this is possibly because of the way we haven't UV mapped it yet, but there's different options for different nodes. And you can see we're in a new menu here. We're no longer in our kind of default shader. And we'll learn how to use these node menus a little better in a couple classes. But we can see the type. Currently it's set to V ramp. We can try like a U ramp, and it's the opposite direction. And it's gonna look a little different the way the ramp goes. Diagonal ramp. I don't think any of these are gonna be too good for what we're doing. There's a circular ramp. And again, you can see here visibly what they all kind of look like. Let's try this UV ramp. Definitely not gonna work. But again, it's not gonna really necessarily work for what we're doing for this one, but you can see there's a bunch of different styles. I'm just gonna go back to a V ramp. And again, I can select the color here, select like that green. I want it to be mostly that green, and then maybe a little bit of white, and maybe I don't want it to be so smooth, the gradation, so I'll bring these a little closer. And then render it out, and now we can see that gradient. So it goes green to white, pretty easy. V ramp goes left to right, so I should go top to bottom here. Different options, different settings. Again, we'll learn how to fix kind of it so it colors across things a little bit better. But you get the point. The coloring isn't all one solid thing now. So what I want you guys to do is that I have 2 texture files. If you haven't downloaded them yet, please go to the Moodle section, download the 2 texture files, and then come back here, and then we're gonna apply a texture map to our object. Okay, so to get back to our regular node, we can just simply click on our object again, and we should come back to our base mode. And then you can see that when I click this, it will jump back into our different node system. And currently, it's still connected to our gradient node. So to break that connection, we kind of can't do it here as far as I know. But to break this connection, I wish there was an easier way. There probably is, but I've never learned it. To to break it off because we don't want it to be controlled by that ramp anymore. We want it controlled by a texture file. So the better way to kind of control what we've been doing is to use what's called the hypershade window. And the easiest way to get to hypershade is that this little blue circle up here is the hypershade shortcut. So I want you to click it to open up hypershade. It's a new window. And this is your shader editor. Okay? And what you'll see, these are all of the different shaders that we've created today. So every shader in your scene will be listed here. There's nice things we can do. Let's go. I like to do this, a nice organization. Most of these shaders we're not using anymore. So I like to go to Edit, Delete Unused Nodes. And no nodes that are used in my scene will be shown here. These are all the different nodes here. So this is all the shaders we currently have. These are all the nodes that we have that we can add. This is where our node is going to be edited. So let's all go to Lizard, or whatever your one is called, hold down right click, and we're going to select Graph Network. And the node system is going to pop up here. I know it's a little small on my screen. I can't really read it. Your normal zoom pan controls will absolutely work in here as well, though. So you should be able to zoom and pan in this window. Okay, so what you're seeing, this is a preview of what the shader is going to look like. Okay, the property editor is the same thing, exact same window and settings that we are getting in the attribute editor. So you can see there's our base color, specular, transmission, subsurface, emission. It's the exact same settings. And you can see that it's connected to a node. So this is kind of the output going to our scene. We don't mess with this. This is the AI standard surface shader. And you can see that when I click on it, it shows the settings for it. And that's what we've been using. And right now my color is connected. And you can see that right here it says base color. I'll zoom in. And that's currently connected to my ramp node. And if I click this, there's my ramp node attributes. And you can see that its out color is going to the base color of this. And again, some nodes have different nodes automatically attached to them. Like this is a place 2D texture node. There's the ramp node. There's the lizard or AI standard surface node. And this is kind of the outputs to the scene node. I don't want this ramp node to control the base color anymore. So I can either select this and delete, or click on this and just hit the delete key. And it's no longer controlled by it. You can see this is all green. Okay. Now, if I want this controlled by, say, a texture, I can go to color, reconnect it to a new node, or add the node, drag and drop the node from here to here. But I'm going to go, easiest way is always this. I'm going to click this. And to connect to a texture, we have to connect it to a file, an image file. So we're going to look for the file node. So I'm going to click this right here. And there's our file node. And we're going to select the file node. And right here where it says image name, we need to click our little browse button. And we need to find our texture file. So I'm going to click this. And I have mine saved in my downloads under seamless textures. And it's seamlesstexture.jpg. It's just this kind of craquelure ground plane. So I'm going to hit open. And now you can see that this texture is applied. And even in this view here, some nice things. We can use our rotate zoom tools if we need to. This is a seamless texture, so if it loops and you repeat it, you shouldn't see the seams of where it loops. So we haven't learned how to UV map yet, but UV mapping, you'll notice that in the next class, why it looks okay on these and probably won't look good by default. But we can also like adjust some things in here. Now I'll say before I do this in case it does crash, This is showing a preview in Maya software. We can switch to a preview in the Arnold shader, and it gives us a nice kind of preview, and you can see we're using what's called an HDRI. We'll learn that in a couple classes. But that's what the shader preview will look like in Arnold. And we can even adjust the preview. So this is a standard shader ball, usually good to use. But if I was doing clothing, I could set it to cloth, or there's a teapot. If I was doing like water, I could do something like ocean or ocean splash, and that's what it'll look like on a liquid. Glass splash. And it gives you different previews to kind of match how you're going to use it. And again, like some of those presets like water, milk, they'll really show off what they look like and how they're supposed to be utilized here. I'm just going to go back to the shader ball. But now I have this texture file on it. And you can see that in my preview, it doesn't really show the texture file. In order to preview a texture in your scene, 5, we've been using if you hit the 5 key, that's standard shader. If you hit 6, it will show textures in your scene. And there we go, we now have textures in our scene. This is just for the preview. If you hit 7, it turns on lighting preview, which again is not that accurate, but it shows you it. Okay, 5 to go back to normal, 6 to show textures. Keep in mind, 6 takes more processing power, 7 takes even more. So if your computer is really slowing down while you're trying to work, just go back to 5 key. It's just a preview. Okay, but now when I render, I should see that texture control the color of my character. And there we go. Okay, now keep in mind, just so you guys know, like I put it on a base color. I have you can see here, I have like my roughness all the way up. Color is controlled by the texture. If I wanted my metal, to have this texture on it, I can put metalness up. It might not look exactly the way we expect. So there we go. Also, it's the roughness that's up super high. So if I bring this down to maybe 0.5, it'll look actually a little more metal. You can see it's got that kind of aluminum gloss to it, but that texture is still there. So all of these settings, even, I wouldn't want to, I'd want to go to like transmission color and add the texture to that. If I wanted to apply the, this to like cast light in the brighter spots and not cast them in the darker spots, like where the cracks are at. But if you know these settings, they're incredibly powerful, what you can do with them. So I'm just going to go and bump up this. You know what? I'll keep the roughness a little down here. A little bit of gloss on it. Simple color. So you'll notice if you go and take your models that you currently have and you apply these textures to them, they're going to be all stretched out and they're not going to look very good. And it's because they haven't been UV mapped. The reason it looks okay kind of on this model is because this model, because it comes from the content browser, that's automatically been UV mapped for you. So we're going to learn that process in next class. So know if you go and apply a texture to one of your current models, it probably will be all stretched out. It's the only thing I'm showing you today that will look a little odd. Okay, so what I want to do is show you one last thing today. And I want to show you just how to add a basic bump map to your object. And I've already created a bump map, and a bump map's good to start with because usually you can take, I have the extra notes on this if you want to do it in something like Photoshop. But usually you can take your color map and you can desaturate it, maybe sometimes adjust some of the levels to make the black's blacker or the white's whiter, or less dark, less bright. But you can kind of create a bump map, usually pretty easy, just by desaturating it, because a bump map needs to be in grayscale. So I've created a bump map already, and what I want to do is show you where to connect it. You can either do it here in the geometry menu, but I'm going to show you in the hypershade. just so you can see that node network here get added. So I'm going to go select my AI standard surface so you can see the current texture. I'm going to scroll down and find the geometry menu and pop it open. And you can see that it says bump mapping. And I'm going to go ahead and click this little node right here. I'm going to connect it to a file because my bump map is an image file. Okay, and you can see that it creates a bump 2D node where before it didn't create that bump 2D node. But to create a bump map, we need this extra node. So here's our file node, and that's where we load in our image file. So I'm going to go and click this, and I'm going to find seamless texture bump.jpg and hit open. Okay, and here with our bump node, this is where we can control how strong the bump is with our bump depth. So if I make this larger, the bump should be more intense. It should be raised more. If I lower it, it should be much, much lower. Okay, so let's try this. And I'm gonna render this again. And you can see that the skin, again, this bump is very high, but you can see the skin in the darker zones here. You can see those kind of bumps, all of that kind of raised up around it. And that's what a bump is doing. It's telling it like these darker zones, the light's getting trapped in there. These brighter zones, maybe it's not getting trapped in there, or vice versa. So you can see they look very much like grooves, and especially down in the hand, it's much easier to see where there's a little more light. And that's the bump depth. We can see it right there. So if I were to lower this to say 1, which was its default, the bump map is going to be less intense, but still visible, much less visible here. Looks really nice on the back leg. It's pretty good here. And if I were to go to negative, it's going to do the opposite. So maybe, you know, I'll just do this quickly at 5. Maybe it's raising the dark zones currently. A little hard to tell. It looks like it's indenting the dark zones down here. If I were to go to -5 and redo this, it's going to flip it to the opposite direction. So whichever one it was indenting before, now it is raising. So it's just inverting the black and the white on your actual bump map. And you can see, I think it actually looks a little bit better in this case in the negative value. Might be a little too strong for such a low quality, but it works. But there's our bump. Maybe I'm gonna just go -3 here. And you can see how much better it looks with a bump map, that lighting on this object. Brings it to life dramatically better, like all the color detail. This looks like a much higher resolution model, but it's not. It's a super low res model. And we've brought all that detail back in just using 2, a texture map for color and a bump map to really give some depth to that lighting in it. If you do have a repeating texture, often you won't, but this in the case, it's a seamless texture and it can repeat. We can always, I'm just gonna go back to our hypershade here. This is where you load in the texture. The place 2D texture here, this actually controls if it repeats or not. And currently it doesn't repeat, it's 1 by 1. So it only repeats once. If you do want it to repeat more times, I could go like 3 by 3. And it's gonna make the texture smaller. The higher these numbers go, you can make them staggered, but it will stretch it out. So you usually want these to be the exact same number. You can rotate it if you need to as well. I don't in this case. But I'm just gonna go 3 by 3. And there's currently the scale that it's at. And you'll see that it looks much smaller now, especially down here in the hands. So you can adjust the scaling, you know, of this very easily. So here'll be 2 by 2. Now keep in mind, this is a seamless texture. It's built to repeat. If you have a texture that's not seamless, you'll see visibly the seams on your object, which will not look very good. And I kind of like that 2x2 looks pretty good for this. But you can see that bump, all that extra detail looks great. Really useful to add the detail. Okay, so it's a lot to learn and practice. I know I went through it very quickly. Hopefully you've slowly gone through and tried some things out for yourself. Before you go to the next class, all I want you to do is experiment. A good test would be to just add some basic polyspheres to your scene. So just go and keep adding a lot of polyspheres or just any primitive. Add like 20 of them to a scene, add some lights, and then try to create 20 unique shaders and see how very different you can make them look. Try having some with texture, some without. Try making some emission, some glass type shaders or translucent shaders, metal shaders, non-metal shaders, shiny, rough. Try to see the various types of shaders you can create, and start thinking about which project 1 or 2 are you going to use, and what type of shaders will you need to kind of build out a scene for that. Okay, so practice that, and I'll see you in the next class. Bye.